Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, with a terrific episode that we recorded back in February with Sylvia Smith, one of the coordinators of Project of Heart, a fantastic program that teaches kids about the residential school system in Canada. And the way in which this program started, the very organic way that it had its origination, is really quite fascinating. And Sylvia talks about that on the podcast. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Sylvia Smith. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So Project of Heart, we just went through some of the amazing things the project has done. But for anyone who isn't familiar with the project, where did this idea come from and what is it that you're doing?
This started as a result of young teenagers, grade 10 history students, who were pretty upset when they found that what they had been learning most of their lives, and what they had been learning most of their lives in history was the European history, was a history that was full of grand, older men, mostly English speakers, and many of them were taking it over again for the second time or maybe even the third time because it just didn't hold their interest. This is at a school, an alternate school called Elizabeth Winwood in Ottawa, and I was their teacher. So Project of Heart actually started because kids felt that there was a need for greater education of the past that they considered hidden, of a past that they wanted to look at more carefully, and at a past that they thought deserved to be told about it. So I am the kind of teacher, I guess, that when I see students' passions being raised and an interest in something that goes deeper than just the surface, will facilitate that. And so one student in particular was learning about Indian residential schools, and she was perusing the internet and found that there were all these children that died. And of course that begged the questions, why did this happen? I've never heard this before. Why am I just finding out about it now? And why was it almost accidental? Because the history book that they were learning from, which is still, by the way, okay to teach from today, had 63 words in it dedicated to Indian residential schools. That's out of a textbook that has 420 pages in it. Okay,
that's
so
terrible.
yes, by anyone's standards, that is terrible. Making sort of a long story short, I said, well, do something about it then. I'll support you in whatever you want. And she and some of her friends made a proposal to the staff. They wanted to get some tiles, some small wooden tiles, so that they could start decorating these tiles and commemorating the loss of all the children that went to these schools. And they wanted to get as many resources as they could. So this was online. They got as many as they could. And because the archives is close by, we were able to hit the archives. And these students actually put into being something that was really, really meaningful, and not just for them, but for the rest of the students in the school. I was the facilitator. I sort of helped them piece it together so that it would make sense and follow a certain path. And they were right. This did hit the heart of a lot of people. And I guess, well, Project of Heart just became something that our school did on a continuous basis. And one day, a couple of community members had heard about it, and they participated in one of the sessions. And keep in mind that this wasn't just for schools. This was also for, any group that actually wanted to learn something about their history. So faith groups found out about it. There have been yoga clubs and book clubs that have done Project of Heart. Anyway, these two community members said, we want to nominate you for a Governor General's Award. And I was very hesitant because this was not I didn't consider this my project. This was a community project. An elder, an Ojibwe elder, even named the project. So I thought, that doesn't really feel right. But when I saw what they were going to do with it, in fact, they made a nominating committee. It wasn't just going to be, one person. It was going to be a group thing. And they were very clever in how they went about it. They said, Sylvia, this needs to get national attention within the educators. Because if this can win a national award, that means that this project is going to be spreading a lot more than just in Ottawa. And, they were right. They were right. So it did win. I don't even say I won it. I say it won.
The project won.
Yeah, the project won a Governor General's Award. And I happened to be the name attached to it. And you're right, it really did become very, very popular. And in fact, at the time, this was in 2011, the CBC was doing a documentary on, it was called The Eighth Fire. And the producer of the second episode contacted me because he found out that that the project had actually started in my school. And he said, I'd really like to know a little bit more about it. So I was able to give him a teacher's name very close to Toronto. And he and his crew went out there three separate times, and it's featured quite prominently. It was featured then in Eighth Fire. After that, after the Governor General's Award and that award, it truly did get that national coverage, and then it sort of wrote itself.
Right, and when you look at the site, all the different schools, like there's a list of everyone who's used the project from across the country. It's an expansive list, but before we get into that, I want to just focus on this built part of it, because that's the really interesting part to me, that the students come to you, and it's really a student initiative, which is the stereotype of high school students is that they're lazy and bored and don't really want to be involved. So here we are, kids who are taking a clear interest in something, want to learn about something that isn't included in the normal courses, and certainly it's something I didn't learn about in my high school history courses. As far as I remember, I wasn't paying that close attention in high school history, I'll be perfectly honest. But then, but it goes beyond sort of the core curriculum that we normally associate with high school history of memorize this, learn it, and tell it to me on a test, and then forget it 2 days later. And they're going and putting together something tangible. So did that come from them? That was their idea to have these tiles, to create these built tangible things?
It's really, it was a conversation that we had as a class, and I can't even remember exactly whose idea the tile was, but I know that we had discussed paper, like cutting out pieces of paper, and then for each life that was lost because of this residential school experience, you would take a strip, tape it together, and then you'd build like a chain, like a paper chain. Yeah. And then we thought, but a paper chain, that's not going to last very long. Like, we might get it up for one day in the gym, right? And then we had a teacher working at the school who loved doing woodwork, and he brought out a calendar, like a magazine, a woodworking magazine, and he said, well, take a look at this. And I guess that's where it came from, because there were all these cutouts, these wood cutouts. And we thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect, because they kind of looked like a little grate. The shape of the tile was slightly rectangular, and that it was small. It just fit all the criteria that we would need in order to decorate the thousands that we knew we would need, because we knew that those children's deaths were in the thousands. And also they could be easily packed away, because they're all uniform size. So it didn't take long. As soon as we landed on that, we thought, okay, that's great. We can decorate those. And when you were saying it's not the stereotype sort of that we have of students. Yeah. I must say that at this school, these were the students who fell between the cracks in the regular system. So that's even more.
So even worse than the normal stereotype. We have a worse stereotype of these kids.
Like I said, one of these kids had been taking history for the third time.
Right.
Because it had never been put in a relevant form where they could act and interact historically and bring that into the present, because it didn't take them long. I mean, they were able to connect the dots and be able to see that, even though Indian residential schools aren't here anymore, the attitudes that spawned them still are.
Right.
When we look at present day social justice issues. So it was a recipe made in heaven. It was, anybody can interact with it. Heck, some of the kids that had the most difficult time in school, in a sort of more stereotyped classroom, those were the superstars here. Right. It's unbelievable.
Because it's something different. It gives, right? I mean, and I'm a huge proponent myself, and certainly at the university level, you're somewhat restricted to what you can do. That there's a certain standard, but I mean, for the past few semesters, my final projects have on the syllabus it's just said do whatever you want. Come talk to me first, but do whatever you want, and then. The theory behind it is they'll pick something that they're interested in, they're invested in, and therefore will do a better job. That's sort of my theory behind it, and it seems like that's very similar to what's going on here.
It is. It's you're appealing to their passion. Mm-hmm. When you appeal to a passion, then you're going to get a much better product without even trying.
Right.
I mean, it could because it's there.
Yeah.
I have to. What you said about, allowing them to do something that they want. That's exactly what my professor, I was taking, this is back in 2007, I was taking a social justice class as a graduate student at the University of Regina. And my professor, whose name is Dr. Mark Spooner, said that, okay, the last, normally what we do is an essay here. So, choose what you want to do in your essay. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is my opportunity to actually write up what my students were doing. Right. Because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was just in its infancy stages. This was the first one, not the second one. And I thought, wow, maybe I'll ask my prof if I can do a proposal to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because at the time they were calling for commemoration projects. And my professor said, just run with it. This would never have gotten where it was had my professor not actually given me the opportunity. If he hadn't said, yes, that's fine, because it was like a 20-page proposal.
Sure, yeah.
So that gave it then its official structure. And, we were off.
And it's cool when there's space for that, right? Because, I mean, the point of history is to do stuff like this, to make it relevant and bring people in. So in a history course, there should be that space. And then I guess another question I would have is, how do you make sure, or how do the students then connect the tiles and the physical part, the production, to the knowledge of what happened? I get the symbolic connection of recognizing the deaths and everything, but on top of that, sort of the reality and the hardship of the day-to-day life and the damage to Indigenous communities and breaking up families. How does all that get connected back into it for them?
Okay, well, I think the first thing is to understand what the project actually entails.
Sure, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So there are 5 parts of this project, and keeping in mind that at that time, 2007, there is no information on Indian residential schools for the public.
Yeah.
Okay. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation had started its work, and there was lots of stuff that the Aboriginal Healing Foundation had, but that's far from getting into the public, and especially into the schools.
Yeah.
So the project consists of now it consists of 6 parts, but then it was 5 parts. The first part was the research. Just learning about the residential schools. How many were there? Why? It's really the intellectual part, like just the knowing of the facts and getting to understand that this hidden history really may have been hidden for a reason. Now that we're starting to learn something about it, then the second.
Is that done independently? I'm just curious about the structure of that research and how that takes place for the students. Does it vary?
It's varied. Yeah. It's varied for in the school that I came from. All the students learned from independent learning materials. So there was no one student at the same place at the same time.
Right.
Okay. Now in the elementary school, if you're doing Project of Heart with the kindergarten kids, with their research is going to be reading a book, a children's book, like Shinchi's Canoe, and it doesn't talk about children's deaths, but it does talk about what it's like being taken away from your mom and your dad and missing them, right? So it's context, whatever the context is, you fit that research into that context.
Right, so we can tailor it to...
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first part is the research part, learning about the schools. The second part is for... At that time, that was the first phase of Project of Heart. The school who was doing it, or the classroom that was doing it in their school, would pair themselves with an Indian residential school somewhere. So if they were taking, let's say, geography, and they were looking at the topography in the Arctic, maybe they would have chosen something from the a school from up north, okay? Or if it was a civics class, and they had 143 to choose from, right?
Yeah,
so. And what they would do is, once they'd chosen that Indian residential school, they would learn something about the original peoples on whose land that school stood or stands. There's still a couple of them around. And they'd learn about what their contributions were to Canada, or are to Canada. Okay? So this is where they can look historically at figures, from what we think of as history way back, before the borders, the colonial borders were put up, or they can look at recent, contemporary figures. And I can tell you right now that the students I deal with, the contemporary was the most appealing, okay? They would look at the Qu'Appelle Indian Residential School. They found, oh, wow, Buffy St. Marie came from there, after she was born, and she's, so they have all this, they have a plethora of people to choose from, because there have been many. We have just piles of examples of Indigenous peoples who have made it in a very non-Indigenous world, made successes, and have contributed to this cultural mosaic. Sometimes we don't even know they're Indigenous. So that was really good for the students, because they realized that second part is absolutely essential, because a lot of times when non-Indigenous people are teaching history, we tend to always see people that aren't us through the lens of victim. And this really brings it home to the kids that, in spite of all the hardships that Indian residential schools and all the other colonial practices that have been, things that have been done, it shows you how strong those cultures really are and were, to be able to still be here today, alive, well. And there's, of course, cultural resurgences that are going on all over the place. Yeah. So that's the second part. The third part, then, is where the student gets the tiles, the wooden tiles that have not been decorated, and they know symbolically that each tile represents a life, the life of a child that didn't return. And the student can decorate this any way they want. This is their first gesture of reconciliation. This is them. It's a little piece of themselves that they put out there in an artistic form to demonstrate their sorrow, I guess. All of our students knew that the government at the time was it was Mr. Harper's. They knew that apology wasn't real. They knew that. Mm-hmm. They could tell by what had happened within 6 months of making the apology. Right. All the funding to the Sisters in Spirit movement gets cut. You have the money to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation that had 130 projects going on across Canada, all cut. So the walking the talk really wasn't there. Mm-hmm. So, but they knew that even though our government might not be sorry, they were learning, and they were taking this to heart. So that's what that first gesture of reconciliation is about. After they're finished decorating the tiles, then the fourth part is where a residential school survivor is invited into the learning space, and that person can do with that group of learners whatever he or she wants. It may be an elder. Maybe they'll do a smudging ceremony. Maybe the elder is also a survivor, so they can actually answer questions about the Indian residential school experience, what they had to go through. Before this person is invited in, we make sure to, they know what it's about, and that if it isn't part of their healing journey, then it's, That's not the appropriate place.
Right, so it's designed to be mutually beneficial.
That's right, that's right. And it doesn't even have to be a survivor. It can be an intergenerational survivor. It can be a cultural worker. Whatever it is, that person has to be able to speak to the Indigenous experience as experienced by, as an Indigenous person. So First Nation, Métis, or Inuit person. And so that, when I would do sort of evaluations of what the students got out of things when this was finished, this always rated as one of the highest. Right. Just because we don't get that kind of learning in schools, that heart, spirit kind of learning. So the kids really, that means a lot to them, that fourth part. Then the fifth part is the social justice piece. And our students knew that talking wasn't enough. They knew that it's great to decorate a tile and to have these lovely visual representations, but they knew that unless there was some action behind it, that you can't really build trust. So the social justice piece was the piece where the students learned about an issue facing all Indigenous people today, and then taking some action on that. So it's really, that's the second gesture. That's the part where it says, even though my government might not be sorry, we are, and we're going to stand with you in whatever resistance struggle or sovereignty struggle or whatever it is that you have. So our kids, just every year, we went to Parliament Hill. We wrote to the Prime Minister or the Minister of Indian Affairs or Veterans Affairs even, and they would write letters on a number of different issues. But there were three things we always did. When we were at the very first Sisters in Spirit Vigil, where they met the families of those that had, loved ones that went missing or had been murdered, those students developed such remarkable abilities to write that even I was astounded. They went through Amnesty International reports. They did a whole other kind of research in that fifth part, just because it was important that they get it right. This was right about the time, actually, the 10th anniversary is coming up on the 24th of this month, and that is when Dr. Cindy Blackstock made her, and the Assembly of First Nations filed their discrimination complaint at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, Canadian Human Rights Commission. And so our students were right in there for the very first hearing. They went down to the federal court to support Cindy because, of course, that was when Mr. Harper was in power, and they fought that all the way through. So right up through the rest of my teaching career, our kids were at federal court supporting the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. So that was how Project of Heart was. Those are the 5 different parts. Yep. So we sort of covered as many bases as we knew to cover. Right. And then at the national event, one of the national events in Saskatoon, one of the teachers there who had done Project of Heart with her kids realized that there was another part that we just had to do. And at that point in time, this remarkable educator, her name is Charlene Barehead. She's right now the education lead at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. But we gifted the group of people that she was working with at the time in Edmonton with Project of Heart because we couldn't keep up with it. It was just getting to be too much. The materials that we were putting together were all hard copy materials, and it gets pretty. Yeah.
And when a teacher says the hard copy is there's too much material, it's too much material.
And we were sending these all the way, like I said, we even sent them to Germany. We sent to Germany.
Yeah,
like it was big. So anyway, Charlene and her crew said we'll do this, we'll administer this, and of course they're out in Western Canada in Edmonton. So at this point in time, so they were able to make it even broader. She just brought in so many more links, and the teacher in Saskatoon said, "You know what? I've been talking to a lot of survivors, and a lot of them don't know about Project of Heart. She said, why don't we do something and let them know that people are caring, kids are learning about this? So that's when the 6th part was added, and that's called the Survivor Card. So now when groups do this, they can, if they wish, develop a card that explains what Project of Heart is, and then you open up the card and it's got a picture of the learner group, and then they say something about what this has meant to them, and they paste or glue on a tile on the edge of their card. And then when they go to an event where there are Indian residential school survivors there and they meet them, they can give them a card. And then it's full circle, right?
Which is really terrific, and it seems like it's something that provides opportunities for the students to, if we're thinking, I'm thinking just the academic for a second. Like academically, it creates the connection past present, right? It makes it so that history isn't this static thing that happened, it doesn't matter anymore. It creates that linkage, and so I'm not
continuity,
right, and I'm not surprised that a lot of students would be more interested in the contemporary, because that's sort of the orientation that a lot of students have. But even if you take it back to the older stuff, that history is still in play. Like it hasn't. So it's nice that it sort of all gets connected, and in that process, as students are coming into contact with survivors and members of the Indigenous community, what is the reaction from the people who are coming in, from whether it be survivors, cultural leaders, elders? What's their reaction to the project been?
Oh, really good. Yeah, very good. And in fact, I'll just tell you, like last week, what we had happen in Saskatoon. Indian Institute of Technology contacted me because they were having a survivor, sort of like a conference. There were going to be 91 Indian residential school survivors that they were putting on workshops and things for. And she said, is there anyone that can come out from Project of Heart and facilitate this for us? Well, actually, you know what? Project of Heart isn't one of these things that has a big building and a multi-million-dollar funding. It's very grassroots. And when they see the website, they don't necessarily think that. They think that it comes with...
It looks very... not grassroots. Like it looks very professional. It looks like
which it is, but it's all people's volunteer time. And I often say one of the reasons I think it was so successful is because it wasn't funded.
Right.
So there was nothing to take away, right? I mean, a lot of times grassroots organizations have a lot of difficulty with the funding because if it doesn't follow the requirement of the funder, then off you go. And of course, when you're doing political action work, even though it's non-partisan, that's still, so it can be threatening.
Sure.
So anyway, I said, don't worry about it. We'll get you going. And I said, you've got enough knowledge there with the survivors that I don't think you need someone to facilitate. But I said, we can help you out. I'll send you the tiles. And here's what was so neat about this. I said, there's an elementary school in Ottawa right now that is part of the Shannon's Dream. They do the Shannon's Dream thing at their school. It's a club where Shannon Christian was a First Nations young woman who was very vocal about getting a proper school on their First Nation. They hadn't had one for years and years, and that was at the time, again, Chuck Strahl was the Minister of Indian Affairs and wouldn't move on that and give them what they needed. Right. So she started really the first youth movement when it comes to equity in education. So this dream lives on. As Shannon was killed tragically in a car accident on her way back to her home community. But the dream is there, and these kids, we've got kids all across the country that have these Shannon Dream clubs. And they create little postcards in this school. It's Lady Evelyn Alternative School. And they color the most beautiful postcards, and it'll be, Shannon's, it'll be schools like equity for all students and have a heart for First Nations kids. Like it's all part of trying to get the government to live up to their responsibilities. And I said, these kids have 100 of these cards. I said, would you like me to send them out to you, to the survivors? Mm-hmm. And I said, if you're doing Project of Heart, this can be their social justice piece. I said, they already have the labels on them for the Prime Minister, I said. And all you have to do is show a clip of Cindy Blackstock talking about why this issue is important and why the government needs to implement the human rights order, to fund these children in all aspects of their lives to the same extent that they do non-Indigenous children. And she said, that's great, we'll do that.
Oh, nice.
So those 100 cards went out from this school, so there's now the connection with these young, mostly settler kids who are being connected with all of these survivors in Western Canada. And then on the day after Have a Heart Day, on the 15th of February, they're going to Skype with each other.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh,
so the
cool.
survivors, the kids can see the survivors with their postcards, with their beautifully colored and marked postcards, and the same thing with the kids. So it's just this relationship builder that pokes holes in all of our silos, so that we can begin to build that thing that we need, that kind of knowledge base that speaks to the heart.
Right. In that realm, though, I mean, now you have some capital and some the experience of when you go to different groups, you have this track record of this is what we've done. But I'm curious, early on, you're a teacher, you have your students who are interested in this idea and learning more about this issue. And did you personally have experience with these issues, and how did you take the kids' thirst for knowledge and take that to Indigenous communities, and how were those initial connections made? I'm curious about, because I think one of the things that maybe a lot of historians, non-Indigenous, settler historians, may be nervous about is those initial connections with the Indigenous community or Indigenous communities, more not out of any ambivalence or anything else, but more out of just an uncertainty of how to approach these issues. So I think a lot of folks just avoid them as much as they can, which of course is counterproductive. So I'm curious as to those initial steps, as to how you created those bridges and brought everyone together.
Okay. So the first thing I had to do was make sure that this project was actually an ethical project and that it would be supported. And I did all the groundwork. I contacted Indigenous scholars from across Canada as well as non-Indigenous scholars from across Canada, and I said, what does this have agency? Because, you can't get numbers. Like, there are no... you don't keep track of genocide and write each person's name, right? And a lot of these records were burnt in the schools and et cetera, et cetera. But I had such... generally speaking, on behalf of the scholars who were non-Indigenous, there was more of a cautious note. Okay, and also I was told, don't call it genocide, but still thoughtful. They didn't try to dissuade me, but they were a little like it did seem very. It did seem like I might be biting off a little bit too much.
Like when you hear it, it's a super ambitious project.
Yes, they thought it might be a little bit ambitious. Yes. Okay, then I contacted the Indigenous scholars, and Marie Baptiste from the University of Saskatchewan was very helpful because she opened it up to all of the Indigenous scholars that she works with, and it was quite. It was very good. I said, yes, go ahead with this. And none of them, not one, had a problem with the G word either.
Okay.
So, then I went to Peterborough and I saw Dr. Malloy, and I said, because at that time there were really only two books. There was one by Jim Miller, and then the one, A National Crime by John Malloy. And I live a long way from Saskatchewan, so it was easier to go to Peterborough. And we had a great chat together, and he said, it looks good. He said, I'd go with it. So, you can't do much more than that. I reached out, so I know, okay, ethically, this is good. I know if I'm ever questioned, I've got backup.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So a lot of the scholars knew that this work was, that it was coming, but of course I'm just a no-name teacher from, I'm sure I went off radar very quickly. Then as soon as it started being done, and you invite, the Indigenous person in, it doesn't take much time at all. They talk with their communities. They talk with their people. Word spreads very quickly. And there was nothing but support for this. Nothing but support. So, I guess I'm lucky, but at the same time, I don't know.
As long, you're covering all the bases. You're being proactive in reaching out to as many people as you can, which is always better than being reactive. If someone says, "Hey, what did you think about this?" I forgot about that. Right? At least like the proactive nature of it, is really helpful. And I think another thing that works in the project's benefit early on, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's student driven. Is that it's not something that you're going around and saying, "Hey, I want to sort of include this in my class." It's students saying, "We have to include this in our class. We want to know this."
You put the hammer to the nail's head immediately there. It's a collaboration. And as soon in the classroom, when the students see that what they're producing is of value, it's not just the one-on-one, I'm giving this thing into the teacher, she's going to see it, she's going to mark it and give it. The students in my class, couldn't have cared what mark they got. Like, they've been so dispirited by the education system, they just want to pass. They don't care. And that was good for me to see. It was the passion that was coming through, and of course they all got wonderful marks, even though they didn't care what their mark was. Right. But there was a different learning taking place. There was a kind of learning that our Eurocentric system cannot assess or evaluate, and that's the affective component, right? So how does a teacher know when it's probably going to be okay? If you take a group of the most marginalized students that you can have in a city, and they get excited about what they're learning, you know pretty darn quick that it's going to be okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So the process, of course, of taking it to other schools, you have the initial enthusiasm of your students. That would be hard to replicate, I assume, right? That it'd be that organic, because other teachers are going to bring it into their schools. When it's brought into a school, how do you try to recreate that and get it so it's that collaborative effort and it's not the teacher bringing it in and students feeling as though this is just another part of the curriculum? I'm just curious as to what that process is like.
Maybe some teachers do it and they do it like that. I have no idea. I mean, it's not like I was given any release time to go and help these teachers, because my school board actually did not support me really in this at all. No. Yeah. So I think it was just too new. It was too cutting edge. I mean, at the time, 2007, that was when the ministry first announced the whole strategic initiative for First Nation, Métis, and Inuit education, right? And it was the whole, closing of the gap. We want to, okay, all within the colonizers' framework, right? But, we have a pretty conservative board here in Ottawa, and also a board that really believes that initiatives, it's only proper for initiatives to come from here, from,
top down.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we'll pay lots of money to bring in the expert from the United States to come up and tell us. I mean, that's just different boards have different makeups, right? And ours is one that is very, or was at least very proud that it followed the corporate model, and this is what we do. And so here's this teacher, this off-the-wall teacher doing this stuff, and I just don't know. Like, I knew more than what people did at the board, and sometimes it's hard to acknowledge knowledge when it's from underneath you, right? So, but in the end, that turned out to my benefit, because I did know someone who worked within the Aboriginal office at the ministry level, and he gave me a lot of emails of teachers in the province who taught Native studies, and you know what? I went out through that network, and it was amazing, because there were some school boards that just picked up on this like nobody's business. It fit what they needed for that time. Okay. And, it didn't take long for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to pick it up.
Right,
too,
yeah, because,
right?
And so one of the things that is interesting to me is that there is I don't know if it's the right word, but I would say an activist element to this, to what's going on. And you talked about you got some initial resistance from the school board. Because there's an activist element to it, has there been resistance from parents? How do, like, in that element, because, with anything, I mean, some parents would see that go to school, learn stuff. But
well, given that we're marinated as a country in racism, yes, you would think there would be. In my individual experience, no, I got none.
Oh, great.
It's really because, a lot of times, by the time a lot of our students got to us, parents were getting calls home whenever they knew it was a school, they knew it was bad news, right?
Right.
So when they were getting calls home from me talking about how well their child was doing, I don't know if they even knew what the project was. They just didn't have a heart attack, or at least if they did, it was for a good reason.
Right.
Like, they were just so happy that their child was doing well. And, so again, it's that affective component that these kids didn't have to be convinced of anything. They knew from their own personal lived experiences what it meant to be marginalized. So they jumped on board, and it was a collaboration that was extremely easy. In a different school, that could be a different story. So I guess, in terms of teachers, the teachers who were contacting us to get these kits, and by the way, the Legacy of Hope Foundation provided almost all the materials for that, all free.
Wow.
So that was absolutely, it was like a library, and the boxes were about this big. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers actually donated the boxes. Like, we got these sort of connections from
collaboration.
It was collaboration big time. Yeah. Just so many people involved. And then people try to say, will ask you, how did this come? Well, it came from so many sources and so much community building. And I'd even forgotten at one point that it was a grant that, not a grant, I guess I applied for a grant. It was, I think, $2,000 worth or something like that from OSSTF, and from my division, and I got it. So that was actually the very first thing, was a union, that paid for the first set of tiles that we got, and we were able to also have a little lunch after our first survivor visit, because we had community members there. We had representatives from Kairos, we had all kinds of community people who were so excited to know that there was something happening in the school like that.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, obviously that has brought to light a lot of the issues that are being discussed in the project. Has the project changed because of that? And since the Truth and Reconciliation has released its the final report and all the recommendations for reconciliation, how has that particular document then been incorporated into the material? And I guess that's hard to say because it's so
wonderful.
Individualized.
It just gives us more and more solid evidence to say you need to do this.
Right.
You know? So it's wonderful because we can go into businesses, or we can go into places where we might not have gone before, but they've heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They've heard of the 94 calls to action. Well, you know what? The first 3 pages of that report all deal with Cindy Blackstock's human rights tribunal. It's all about children and keeping children with their families in their homes. If we want to start doing some real reconciliation work, we'll quit taking the children away. You know? So, hey, there it is. This is the evidence. This is all the evidence we need. You need to do Project of Heart because it will do that. That's why it's a very holistic way to go about a pedagogy of heart, or a pedagogy of heart and spirit.
Sure. Yeah. And for teachers who want to get involved or who want to bring this into their schools, is it for them to go to the site, look at all the resources? Because when you go to the site, I have to say, there is a lot of material there, and not just like. I guess I'm an educator because I teach at the university, but I was looking at it from the sense of not an educator, because the way I would consume a lot of the website is me, Sean, every man walking around, and there's a lot of stuff on there that isn't pedagogy specific, which is great. But I could also see if I was a teacher going on there and almost being overwhelmed by the volume. So, how do teachers tend to approach this and incorporate it?
All the teacher actually has to do is just look at those steps. The steps are written out and they're very, very clear. There's a very short bit that actually explains, what you do in a very prescribed way. And then the reason given for it, right? Like, you always have to give reasons why you will do this. And so it goes through step 1, step 3, step 4, step 5. And what was brilliant is when Charlene's crew took over, what they did, all the resources that we had been packing up in hard copy, well, they just put it on electronically. So now groups weren't dependent on getting their box, right, of all their resources and their tiles. All the information is there. The archival stuff is there. All the stuff from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, all the newer stuff. So there's its own library almost, right? So they don't have to worry about any cost for them at all, except they have to buy their own tiles. Right. But the link is there. This is who you would get them from. We even have a Canadian supplier now if they want to go Canadian. They're not quite as good. I like how we under free trade how we sell all of our lumber to the United States, and then they cut it there, and then they sell us back our own wood. But we get it from Texas. The quality is a little better than the Canadian products because the Canadian ones are softwood, and most people do this unless you're an art teacher. Most people don't feel really confident about the decorating part. Right. But when they
that'd be what I'd be the most nervous about.
Yeah. Well, and me, I'm not an artist. But it's amazing if you do this. You find out who the artists are in your room. This one that I had showed you. This was the very first student that did it. I had no idea that she knew.
Was the first person who did
That's
them?
the very first student.
Those are so obviously we're on audio here, but so they're painted blue flowers, very intricate designs with dots, and there's a crying girl on one. These are.
They're
spectacular.
Stupendous. So it was an auspicious start. That's the way it's going to start. But, it's Sharpies, right? Because Sharpies, anybody can use them. They're not going to spill all over the place. The only thing you have to do is make sure that they're not water soluble. Right. And I'll tell you that as someone who did this for the first 10 years, there were I realized how many of us have got our own challenges with reading directions, because I would get some back that weren't permanent, and that maybe a cup of coffee had been spilt on that they didn't know about or whatever. So, you do have to read the directions carefully. At one point, they were very beautiful, but then something got on them. And so with the tiles, I mean, you have you brought in a couple of magazines and a book, so some of the examples of things that have been made, and the canoe is spectacular. The Wampum Belt from New Brunswick is amazing. In terms of sort of the final products, what tends to happen with them? Okay, so this is where Project of Art has gone through phases. The first phase was the phase I was responsible for, and when the classroom, when my students and I first started this, we had no idea it would get as big as it got. Right? So our idea was that this would be, we would try to get around 50,000. We ended up collecting 52,000 of them, and our vision was that these would be curated at the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, the Canadian Museum. Now, as it turns out, Project of Art is there, but it's not. But the tiles aren't. They have a visual and an audio corner with Project of Art very nicely displayed. These are now at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. So they're figuring out how how they are going to curate these. So I don't know if it's going to be 52,000 of these, lining 3 walls, or if it'll be. That is still a work in progress.
Okay.
The second phase was these were the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself gave funding to Aboriginal artists in every province and territory, so that schools who participated in this would send their tiles to that location, and then there would be an artistic representation. So in Ontario, it's at Algoma College, because that was
a school.
That was an Indian residential school that's still standing. It's part of Xinhua.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful, I mean, all of these, they were done by artists, right? With all of, so each of them are different. Each of them are stunning, and you just have to know where it is, in which province that the commemorative exhibit is. For example, the canoe that travels, so it's in one place at one time. I don't know exactly where it is, which place in BC it is now, but it goes on tour.
Right.
I don't know.
We should just say it's a canoe with 16,000 tiles lining both the inside and the outside, which is like the photo you brought. It's spectacular.
And this, I know that this, for New Brunswick, this is
the Wampum Belt.
The Wampum Belt is housed in the education department at the University of New Brunswick.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. And it's on this, I would assume that's steel or iron.
Yes, it's iron frame.
And it almost looks like a ramp going
like
up the way it's laid.
Yeah,
which is and very colorful and spectacular. So that's on the campus of UNB.
Yep.
And that's a good, like, in the Department of Education, no less. Like,
that's
a very
and I think the Alberta commemorative exhibit is at the U of A as well.
Okay.
I think. And that's got a canoe, a birch bark canoe that had been damaged, and it's being fixed. The Project of Heart tiles are the patches that are putting the canoe together, and then there's a plexiglass wave that the canoe sits in to house the canoe, and then names and things are incised into that plexiglass. Again, very, very beautiful.
Yeah.
So that's on U of A's campus.
Oh, spectacular.
Yeah.
Spectacular. So for you now, and as one of the people involved at the earliest stages, what's the ultimate, or is there an endpoint for the project?
No.
It seems like it's an ever-evolving collaborative process.
Yes, and it's it's okay. So the second phase was the commemorative exhibits, and then the third phase is it going back into the communities themselves, so that people can do Project of Heart, and have that be that connector, that point of connection with the Indigenous people in their own local territory, because that's really where that's the hard work part. It's in our backyards, right? It's making the relationships within our own communities, so that we're not these two solitudes,
right.
The settlers and the Indigenous people. And there are some schools that have done some really, really lovely stuff with theirs as being sort of that center place. There's also another organization, it's called Justice for Indigenous Women, and as part of Part 5, if you go onto the website, there are these different social justice pieces that you can do. Justice for Indigenous Women is now on there, and what groups can do if they like is they can take their gestures of reconciliation and they can make them into jewelry. And these become witness pieces.
Yeah, and so for the listeners, you're wearing a necklace that has an image of an Indigenous child that is on a necklace now.
Yes.
So that's sort of a visible sign of...
And this child did not return home.
Okay.
This child was, I believe, at St. Anne's Indian Residential School.
Okay.
They can do that, and if they want, there's an opportunity for them to have fundraisers with this through educating people. For example, this is a necklace, and what's really neat about this necklace is it's meant for a man. Most of these necklaces are for women, but this is the education piece now through this initiative, Justice for Indigenous Women. It's to educate mainstream Canadians about the trajectory of incarceration.
Okay.
So from Indian residential schools now all the way up to the present criminal justice system, where Indigenous people are mostly fodder for that. And this looks at some of the statistics surrounding women, like what's wrong with our society when only 1 in 25 women in Canada is Indigenous, and yet they make up 1 in 3.
1 in 3 in prison. Wow.
Yeah. And this was 2 years ago, so this is right at the end of the Harper era. What's wrong with our society when there's been an 87% increase of Indigenous women in prison over the last 10 years? And that was the conservative statistic.
Right.
The statistics went as high in 3 different research studies. They went up as high as 115% increase. So it really shows there's a direct correlation in the racism in our country and its violation of Indigenous women and its over-policing and its under-protecting. Sure. And then this part of the information tag that comes with the witness piece, this is actually written by an Indigenous woman who has had contact with the criminal justice system. And the food wasn't good.
And, the message says the food was right bad.
Yeah.
With a unhappy face drawn on there as well.
So this is the voice that's been marginalized, right?
Right.
But you can bring those voices out so that people know what's actually happening there. And this piece was actually done, this gesture of reconciliation was decorated by a Drumheller Federal Penitentiary person. This was done in a man's prison. So they did Project of Heart there.
Oh, cool. Cool. And it's sort of an outdoor landscape with the tree, the sun, looks like a lake, and I don't want to venture a guess as to what animal that is.
Yeah.
Because I can't really tell, but there's an animal there. So it's an outdoor landscape seen on one of the tiles. So it's another way that the project then is expanding.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
You get a group. There were a bunch of teachers that got together, Justice for Indigenous Women teachers, and they made the jewelry. Right. So you get this story. How many different people have been involved in this? There's an Indigenous woman here. Yeah. There's the person who created the tile. Then there are the people that put the tile together. Right. And there are school children that have done this, and they have. There's a school just across the line in Quebec. They put on a powwow last spring, and they had made jewelry for the powwow, and then they took donations, and they made I think $200 for the Caring Society. Oh, cool. So this all will go there. So there's. And as soon as people find out what it's for, it's like, yes, I want that. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot easier to educate when people see something that's different and they say, wow, what is that? They're ready to listen. Mm-hmm. Unlike when you're on a street corner and you're trying to hand out pamphlets and force things on people, right?
Yeah. When it feels like I'm taking the initiative or nobody wants to be browbeaten by anything, regardless of how great of a cause it is, right? I remember the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto they were one of the first that I remember being with people outside. They'd have these sick kids, the folders that said sick kids on them, trying to get people to stop. And I remember going to Second City in Toronto, and one of their skits was a guy saying, are you interested in sick kids? And the person says, yeah. And he hands him the folder and says, I'm free, and he runs away. It's sort of just a sign of how little traction these things on the street get. So this is seems like a much more effective way to get people interested in such an important issue.
And what our students did before they could go on a field trip, let's say to the federal court to witness what was going on. Before they could go, they actually had to do something, had to connect it to their curricula and to their course, right? Because you can't take kids on field trips if it's not related. So there was this student that was in business. How am I going to connect this to business? I said, I don't know. How are you going to do it? And do you know what she did? Her aunt owned a silk screening company. She got a hold of Cindy Blackstock. She said, can we use your logo? I'm going to get some shirts made so that when we go into federal court, people will know we're there to support you.
Wow.
And she did.
Wow.
So we all went in with T-shirts that had, and there's a great picture of these if you ever want to Google it. Cindy Blackstock and Peter Mansbridge, when he's had an interview with her. At the very end of their interview, you see Elizabeth Winwood students, there's a picture of them kneeling with their backs and the T-shirts there.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's
so
awesome.
when you've got time,
Yep.
you can go to Peter Mansbridge and Cindy Blackstock, and you'll see
yeah,
those.
you Google it, and Peter Mansbridge one-on-one with Cindy Blackstock comes up. There you go.
But you know, that child, what a difference she made. She used her connection with her family to have these, and of course the kids, you know, we sold them like just to cover costs, right? So it's about $10, and if they couldn't cover it, then the school did. And I'll tell you, Cindy has one of those T-shirts. She wears it all the time on Parliament Hill. And when we were coming back from using them, people on the street would come up and say, "What does that T-shirt? What is this about?" The kids had the opportunity to tell them what they knew, what they learned in school. Well, get that. So we're talking material that's not flushable.
Right. Which is so rare.
They're not learning it just for the exam,
Yeah.
and then they don't have to worry about it. These kids are making history, and they're transforming it every day when they live what they believe. And I think that's where a lot of educators are losing out. Once we start learning that and I'll give you an example, the teachings of the Anishinaabe peoples, okay? Their pedagogical system is to raise children that have courage, that are honest, that are humble, that are respectful. Like all of those are the teachings, right? They're character ed in living life, right? When we can start getting some of those character ed things in as embedded in our institutions, then we are going to start moving that student population towards responsible citizenship. But as long as the only thing that counts, you know, oh, come on, teacher, just tell us what's on the exam. You know, if the only thing that counts is if you have the sort of medicine wheel that's split into 4 parts, and you've got the intellectual or the cognitive, and then you've got the physical, the kinetic, if that's only half of that wheel. The other half is the heart and the spirit. And once you can start hitting those, and you can, in every subject area you can, but it's got to be authentic engagement. It can't be something that comes from the outside.
So for people who are interested, projectofart.ca, and that's probably the best way to get initiated to it and to look through it.
If you're in BC, you can go Project of Heart BC, okay? They've got their own website. If you go to the main website, the national website, it'll tell you where all the other ones are. Yeah,
there's a whole, at the top on the front bar, or the top bar ribbon, whatever it's called, there's all the different provinces up there and all the resources there. So we would encourage anyone, and educators, not educators, lots of information up there.
Learn your history.
And certainly it's a terrific resource, and we're very happy that you were able to make it in today. So
well,
Sylvia,
thank you very much for inviting me. It's been wonderful.
If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.